A very good afternoon to you all. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today for this exciting, we're looking forward to that, lecture of Ambassador Willem, Baron van de Voorde. The title of the lecture you can see here. We are very much interested in learning about how to prepare the EU for current and future challenges. This is very, very timely because currently, as you undoubtedly all know, Belgium has the presidency of the European Council, and that of course brings a lot of challenges for our governments, but also for our diplomatic delegation with the European Commission and of course with many of our European partner countries. Also a special word of welcome to the ambassador. I just want to mention a couple of items of the long and extended CV of the speaker of today, after which we will then go into the content of the lecture of today with an academic introduction that will be presented by Professor Katja Biedenkopf of the Leuven International and European Studies Center. And then, of course, the Keynote Lecture will follow. Very important is that afterwards, as we usually have in these ambassadors lecture series, that afterwards there will be ample time for questions and of course also answers, so please prepare your questions during the lecture. His Excellency van de Voorde studied philosophy at the Universitaire Faculteit in St. Aloysius in Brussels. Later on he moved into law studies at KU Leuven, but also at the London School of Economics, and he also studied political sciences at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, and later on management of change at the Globus Management School in Tokyo. So lots of degrees, lots of various studies, also in different languages, and I think languages is one of the other talents of the ambassador. He started his diplomatic career in 1991 at the Permanent Representation of the European Union, where he also was involved in the previous presidency of Belgium at the European Union, and he now is there again since 2020 as permanent representative of Belgium. From 1994, he was Secretary of Her Majesty Queen Paula, and afterwards he took post as Deputy Head of Mission at the embassies of Berlin and Tokyo, and he returned to Belgium afterwards in 2008 to become one of the directors at the Director General European Affairs of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Belgium. He then was adjunct head of cabinet of Foreign Minister Didier Reynders for a while, and in 2014 he became ambassador in Vienna, where he assumed many responsibilities, including for organizations of the United Nations located in Vienna, and also for Bosnia-Herzegovina, Slovenia and Slovakia. Then he moved on to Berlin, second posting in Berlin, where he was ambassador for a couple of years, and as mentioned, he then returned to Belgium for taking up the permanent representation with the European Union. So we are looking very much forward to the keynote of today, but first it's my pleasure to give the floor to Professor Biedenkopf to introduce the speaker and the topic of today. Thank you.
Thank you. Dear Mr. Rector, dear Vice Rectors, Excellencies, Madam Chairwoman, dear colleagues and dearest students. I would like to start, and I need to change my slides. Does this work? Yes. I would like to start with a personal anecdote and an experience with the Belgian presidency that I made last week and the week before. I was very privileged to join the Belgian delegation to international negotiations on a global plastics treaty, which took place in Ottawa, Canada. On the slide here, you can see low quality photos, sorry for this, but to me, they really illustrate very nicely what the practice of the Belgian presidency has been. Namely, that of an efficient mediator and team player. The Belgian delegation was led by two very competent officials from the federal and the Flemish ministries. You can see them chair an EU coordination meeting at the bottom right corner there. They forcefully represented the EU in plenary and working groups. On the left-hand side, you can see the Belgian co-lead giving a closing statement in the plenary, which was skillfully complemented by the European Commission, which you can see on the photo in the middle. My first-hand experience from being the little fly on the wall in these negotiations was that the Belgian presidency was praised by everyone, and everyone agreed that it did a fantastic job. It were, of course, tough negotiations, and we're not there yet. We took one step closer to hopefully soon agreeing a treaty. This is what we're here today to discuss in more detail. We will hear more from His Excellency Ambassador van der Voorde what the Belgian presidency has achieved and what this means for Europe and the world. But let us briefly look back to past Belgian presidencies. In the second half of 2010, Belgium also held the presidency of the Council. Can anyone remember what happened at the time? Of course, our students might be too young for that. We actually did not have a federal government. I would like to quote one of my colleagues, I'm not sure whether she's here, Professor Edith Drieskens, who wrote a publication with this title, and she wrote, "What initially sounded like a recipe for disaster has become a model for success. A country assuming the EU presidency with a caretaker government for the complete duration of its term." Following the federal elections of June 2010, international commentators showed nervousness at the prospects of long coalition talks and questioned Belgium's capacity to assume the EU presidency. However, when Belgium passed the torch to Hungary, those commentators agreed about the Belgian stint being successful and wrote, watch this, that the lack of government was a determinant factor for success. Well, this time around we had a government. So I'm curious to hear and discuss whether the 2024 presidency was less successful than 2010. This time around, we're again at a crucial year for Belgium and Europe. The Belgian presidency had some important tasks to accomplish. It had to wrap up the current legislative period and term of the current Commission, as well as preparing what's coming next. On the 6th to the 9th June, there will be European elections. All European citizens will be invited to elect a new parliament. As well, on 9th of June, we here in Belgium will elect a new federal and regional governments. This meant concretely that the Belgian presidency had to wrap up a number of important legislative files. If they had not brought them to a good end, they would not have seen the light of day. This was thus an important task with a very clear deadline. I'm sure we will hear much more about what these individual files were and how the Belgian presidency hopefully brought them to a good end. And of course, there's also looking ahead and planning for the next 5 years. Setting course for what comes after the elections is the second important task that the Belgian presidency had to accomplish. And I'm sure we will also hear much more about this, and hopefully we can also go into the details in the discussion. But it's not my role to give the lecture tonight. I'm just setting the scene, and most importantly, introduce our honorable guest, which actually our honorable vice-rector has done already, so I will shorten my introduction. So it is a great honor and privilege to welcome and introduce to you His Excellency Ambassador Willem van der Voorde. He builds on the experience of 2 previous presidencies including the 2009 one, so I hope we can go into some comparison, and now really has been one of the main figures in the ongoing Belgian presidency. And I'm skipping much of what we've heard already, but I just really would like to welcome you, Your Excellency, back to your alma mater, back to KU Leuven, where hopefully some of the foundations were laid for your successful career in multiple countries. And I give you the floor and look very much forward to your lecture.
So, Mr. Rector, Professor Lievens, Professor Biedenkopf, Minister, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a real pleasure to have found some time and also an honor for me to come to my alma mater and to give you firsthand a couple of reflections and evaluations on the presidency. Of course, I have to be prudent. We are over halfway. So we have done 2/3 of our presidency up till now, and there is some stretch to go, some tough nuts to crack. But I think we can already now give some ideas about what we reached, in which context the presidency took place, and maybe look a little bit forward. And I think you sketched very well, Professor Biedenkopf, the general framework of what I will try to explain to you. This presidency, it is the 13th time. So as a founder nation, it's not so difficult to come to that impressive number, whereas, you know, some other member states do it for the second time only. So we have already 13th presidencies, 12 behind us. In the beginning, the rotation was very quickly, with 6 member states, that's logic. Now it takes 14 years, so which 14 years is also the experience, waters down a little bit, and we shall see when our next presidency will take place. Will it be 37 or will it be even in the 40s? That is, the future will tell us. This time of the presidency is truly very special, and you pointed out already. We have, of course, the elections. It never happened before that we had parliamentary elections, European elections, but also national elections in our presidency, which is kind of a challenge. Second, we have a war ongoing at the eastern border of our continent, a bloody and very cruel war, which also never happened actually before to that scale. And third, we live in a real period of political, geopolitical instability with the war in Gaza, which is even further away, but with direct repercussions here, which we feel in our societies here. So I will first set the scene, briefly the scene, because in the title you see how to prepare the EU for current and future challenges. I'll first set the scene, and then I will go a bit deeper in how the Belgian presidency responds to that and interacts with that situation. Now, the end of a mandate, the advantage is that you can look back. There's a period of 5 years. That is how we classify the history of the European Union. And we had the mandate from 14 to 19, from 9 to 14. It was after the Treaty of Lisbon. So now we are in the 3rd mandate after the Treaty of Lisbon came into force. I think we experienced some events which maybe future historians, that's an assumption, open for discussion, may qualify as transformative. And I will just give you a small enumeration. Every year has one. 2020, January, February, the pandemic breaks out, the COVID pandemic. The new Commission and the new President of the European Council are just in function. They were nominated in December 19. The elections took place in June 2019. Then there was a whole process of nomination of commissioners. The President of the Board of Governors knows that, how it works. So it took some time. And on the 1st of December, the new Commission, under the guidance of Ursula von der Leyen, took office. And at the same time, also, the new President of the European Council started working. And 2 months later, catastrophe struck, and so life came to a halt, and institutions came to a halt somehow, the economy came to a halt, and at some moments, I can really witness you, there were moments of slight panic. Just as an anecdote, Coreper was the only committee in the European Union having continued meeting. So everything else was transformed in VTC meetings, video meetings. But there was one committee, there was the Permanent Representatives. They went on. We sat 3 meters, 2.5 meters from each other. And I mean, we survived without too many problems. Stefan knows that period also a little bit from hearing and witnessing, maybe from close by. Good, that was, I think, a transformative experience, and I will come back to that later. Then second, 2021, the next year, in Belgium, we remember that year, that summer, with heavy floodings in the Ardennes and in Germany. Okay, that is maybe not a world-shocking event, but it was quite an event. But what also happened that summer was in August. It was the fall of Kabul. And that is what most people don't remember anymore. But it was a dramatic event also for the view, how the EU saw itself in the world. We saw thousands of NGO collaborators of the European Union, diplomats, officials working in Kabul or in Afghanistan. We couldn't do anything. And President Biden, after weeks and weeks of heavy discussions, maybe you will remember, he was objected of being too slow and not knowing what to do. And all of a sudden, I think it was around the 15th of August, he said, I go. 5,000 soldiers go, and indeed, 5 days later, 5,000 American soldiers were in Kabul, organized the evacuation, of course, of the American citizens, but all of the European citizens who wanted to evacuate, and even of some of our Afghan friends. And 10 days later, the whole army of 5,000 soldiers left. They endured an attack, which was a bomb attack. And all the time through, the EU was discussing. We have almost as much soldiers as the Americans have, and planes and hardware to do it, but there is not a structure to organize it. There is not a single person taking the responsibility. Shall I do it? Shall I not do it? Will I go down in history as a president or the one who takes a decision which is a catastrophe, or is it a success? And here, okay, maybe success is a big word, but it was an operation which ended well, reasonably well. So that was, for the European political diplomatic establishment, this was an eye-opener. So it was maybe not so much observed in the wider public opinion, but for us it was an eye-opener. Look what happened. We cannot even protect our own people in the world, in a theater 5,000 or 10,000 kilometers from us. And that set in motion some of the plans and initiatives which we can maybe, in the question time, dig in a little bit deeper. Then 2022, of course, the 24th of February, the attack of Russia on Ukraine. It was, of course, what we now see, a severe miscalculation of Putin. It was meant as a quick excursion to Kiev and a reversal of the government of Zelensky, and that was the planning at least. And in a couple of weeks, the Russians hoped to do what they did, for instance, in Budapest in the 50s, a quick reversal of the regime, and we have a new satellite or back in the Russian Empire. It didn't work out like that, of course, and we are now in the midst of a war of attrition, already 2 years ongoing, and maybe not really stopping very quickly. That invasion provoked an energy crisis, which was also an eye-opener for us. So we all experienced it in our households when we turned down the thermostats. Here in university, I'm sure you took measures, but it was done really in a very wide scale, all over the European Union. Then in 2023, 2 events. One is not so much noticed, I think, by the wider public, but for us in the EU bubble, it was quite important. The bill came on the table. The multi-annual financial framework of the European Union had to be topped up. It never happened before, but the budget lines were depleted. The COVID had costed money, support measures for the economy after the COVID crisis, then the Ukrainian refugees, all kinds of support, humanitarian support to Ukraine, energy crisis measures, and there was no money anymore, not enough money anymore in the European budget. The Commission proposed in the summer of 23 modifications. It was a very difficult debate, because also the national coffers of the member states were, in many cases, rather empty. So it was a very difficult debate and a discussion on what to choose. Ambitious means to fulfill what is expected, or, observe budgetary discipline and accept that we cannot do what our ambitions dictate us to do. difficult debate, I must say, but it was not so much, I think, covering or going outside the walls of the Schuman area. And then, of course, the war also in Gaza. And it's also, I mean, as I said, far away from here, but with a direct impact on our society. Many people found that Europe was powerless and divided. It's maybe a little bit too harsh, that judgment. We can discuss about it if you want, but good. It was, again, a sober reassessment of what is the position of the European Union on the world scene. So just a list of some of these events, and I think for the first time, probably, a wide feeling of geopolitical loneliness emerged. It was a word which is coined by Luc van Middelaar, and I think it catches well a feeling. And that impression was wider than just the meeting rooms and the cenacles of European Union. The citizens waiting for a vaccine, waiting for masks, waiting for instructions from the governments, observing on the television screens what happened, decisions of the American government, what the Chinese government did, other companies did, and so on. So I think it was a crisis which went in all households, and not just in a particular region in the European Union, or not in the south, as was happening, for instance, in the financial crisis. It struck everywhere. And I think it was a real sobering experience, and for that reason I think we can call it a transformative experience, which had influence on the policies which we have developed, and it will go even much beyond the years which we have now into the future. And I think that sense of vulnerability was really palpable, and one can bring it down in a scheme, a simple scheme. It is Josep Borrell, he's the High Representative for the Foreign Relations. He always coins it like that, but I think it's quite correct. So we had come into a situation of dependency, three dependencies. Energy dependency from Russia. It was quite recent. It began around 2000 with the massive construction of pipelines, cheap contracts, and at some point 50% of the gas supply of Europe came from Russia. So that was an unhealthy situation. A second dependency was more of an industrial nature and was from China. So industrial products, China became a mega export market, a production site, but also a supplier of the European Union for critical raw materials in all kinds of industrial processes in the European Union. Also there, it developed, it was, a cheerful evolution for the economy, which liked that cheap outsourcing source, but it showed at some point, of course, that this can turn you into a tremendous situation of dependency. And then, of course, the third dependency, which is very well known, I don't have to elaborate, that is the security dependency which we have on the United States. So it was a given. It was the oldest of our dependencies since the Second World War, but we have learned also with recent experience and previous presidents that that certainty is not a real certainty anymore. So these were some of the experience we went through, and it brought a concept, again, very much to the attention, which is of strategic autonomy. The European Union has to work at strategic autonomy. It's not new. It's an old debate, 10, 15 years old. It started already around 2010, and then when the Trump administration came to the fore, it's had the first, I would say, it was a first intense debate on how can we protect ourselves a bit better, take care about ourselves a bit better. And it brought even the von der Leyen Commission to coin itself as a geopolitical commission when it started in 2019, precisely because it was already thinking, and I will enumerate a couple of the main lines and themes of this commission, was already looking for answers to these challenges. But I think that what happened in this mandate, in these last years, with the events which I recall since 2020, accelerated and deepened the work which has been done to work at our strategic autonomy. And I think that is really reflected in the legislative program and in the activities which we are also carrying out now, and which I will enumerate a little bit later in the talk. And then I think so that the strategic autonomy received, I think, a totally new dimension and impetus, and it was especially the French presidency which was in charge of leading the European Union when the war in Ukraine broke out, and coincidentally a summit took place, the Sommet de Versailles. And 3 weeks after the start of the war on March the 11th, and there, under strong French influence, and kind of a strategy for a deepening and intensifying of the strategic autonomy of the European Union was described. And all this was, of course, happening against a couple of elements, which adds a little bit to the severity of the situation. This was against the background of the green revolution, the green transition. It is against the background of a very competitive business environment. Just recall the measures which the American government took, the IRA, the famous Inflation Reduction Act, challenging directly also European authorities. And then also, I mean, a complicating factor in these times since 2015 was, of course, the migration crisis. So a rather dark picture, I know, but it doesn't mean that the EU and its member states didn't do anything, and so quite the contrary, as I said. So the von der Leyen Commission started well, I think. It coined exactly what it should do. It was a geopolitical commission, and as the main axis of its program, it had first the Green Deal, and before everything, a growth strategy. It coined it as a growth strategy. It's not a blocking strategy or a hindering strategy. It's a growth strategy that protects the climate. Second, it was building Europe's digital leadership. It wanted to reinforce the competitiveness of the European Union. It was investing in a further development of the social market economy. It was tackling irregular migration. It was dealing with the defense and the reinforcement of our democracy and the rule of law, and working at techniques and proposals to improve the presence of the European Union in the world. I just give you these headings to show that it wanted to give answers to all of the challenges which were identified correctly in the years before. And then apart from that, of course, it had to manage, and I'm looking back a little bit on the past years, on several of the crises which I mentioned. So we managed to defeat the pandemic. We could power Europe's recovery. So the initiative was taken to create a large economic support program, Next Generation EU, injecting 750 billion euros over a short period of 4 or 5 years in the economy, and almost de facto doubling the European budget. It gave a firm response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It worked at strengthening EU's resilience, the security, the defense capacities. We worked at common solutions for the energy crisis. So also there, it's already a long time ago, 2 years ago, in the autumn, especially the autumn of 2022. So for the first time, for instance, an obligation for gas storage was created. We had already an obligatory oil storage, strategic oil storage obligation, which was created after the energy crisis in '73. So since 2022, we also have now, all member states, the obligation to hold a strategic gas reserve. So it was one of the solutions which was found. There were some adaptations to the pricing mechanisms. A common procurement of gas contracts was organized. All that happened in that famous autumn of 2022. So when I think also the unrest in our society about skyrocketing energy prices was at a summit. And then maybe also an interesting, I made reference to the floodings in the European Union, and it was also one of the reasons why the budget of the European Union was depleted earlier than foreseen. We had some pockets of money foreseen for solidarity actions against bushfires, forest fires, floodings, and probably also due to climate change, we had, more of that than was planned or was foreseen, but not planned, but foreseen. And there also, it is a program which is very much appreciated by the member states, and it is one of the very few programs which, in the top-up of the budget of which I spoke, received also additional means, because it is considered as a solidarity tool which brings Europeans together. And member states alone cannot always face it. And so that centralized, organized support is very much appreciated. So this was more or less a rough situation, a sketch of the situation on, I would say, December the 31st of 2023, so just before we took over the presidency, and then entered the Belgian presidency on the scene, the 1st of January of this year. It is a tremendous collective effort. I've witnessed already a couple of times organization of a presidency, and it always gets bigger, I think, even if some of the presidencies are handed over to permanent presidents, but there remains an enormous amount of money to do, of activities to organize. The logistical and the organizational challenges are immense. We use 2 years to prepare such a presidency. That is a normal scenario. And I must say, in the council structures, we are now very well organized. So we have whole teams now, which was not existing when we had a presidency in 2010 or in 2001. We have now coaches in the council secretariat accompanying member states, because you have small member states, you have large member states, you have experienced member states, and others who do it for the second time. So there is a massive coaching foreseen to help also the smaller member states to get around. But of course, we could also use it very well. What does a presidency really do? Some of you know it very well, I think, others maybe a bit less. Let me sketch you some of the main tasks of a presidency, and that could help to explain what it does and what it maybe doesn't. It's part of a complex governance. To sketch it very simply, legislation in the European Union, it's the Commission that makes the proposals, that carries out the treaties and has a legislative program on the basis of the treaties. But the acts have to be adopted by the Council and the Parliament. And both are equivalent arms, branches of the legislative power. It's like a bicameral system. We don't know it really anymore in our country, but in the United States you have the Senate, the House of Representatives. In Germany, the Bundestag, the Bundesrat. It's actually very similar. We got used to that system, but for those who have a longer history in European affairs, it was a real revolution when that was introduced slowly with the different treaty changes over the past decades. Presidencies last 6 months according to a fixed order. That order was established in 2007 after the last large enlargement. And the succession of presidencies is quite interesting. So it's always a succession of a small member state and a large member state, of an old member state and of a new member state, of a Western member state and an Eastern member state, to have a healthy mix of viewpoints on how the EU looks like, because that is quite different whether you are a Danish diplomat or a civil servant or a politician, or you come from Cyprus or from Portugal. It's quite different. Look, we are now where we are in our presidency. We will be succeeded by the Hungarians, a little bit smaller member state, younger, from the eastern side, and before us was Spain. And then before Spain was Sweden, and then Czechia, and so on. So it is a clever organization, I think, to bring different viewpoints to the scene. We adopt always a rolling program. It is also, I think, important to bear in mind. I know that sometimes in publicity talks it is told that the presidency has superpowers to determine everything what happens in the European Union. Of course, the reality is a little bit nuanced, and many balances and checks are now foreseen to avoid too wild swings in political preferences or in priorities which do finally not serve the European Union or the citizens. And that's why a presidency program is elaborated in close cooperation with the European Commission, which has a work program, and so we have to copy and to inspire the drafting of our program, the priorities on what the Commission is foreseeing. We have to look very closely at that. We look at what the preceding presidencies do and what the following presidencies have in mind in order to avoid situations where there is all of a sudden a flare of interest and negotiation for one issue, which then totally disappears after the presidency, after a mere 6 months has gone. So that is all well done. That is a big part of the work which is done in the 2 years which presides the presidency. Then the main tasks, well, it is preside meetings. That's, I think, the essence of the meeting. But it's not so easy, I must say. I mean, the program is fixed. You have responsibility for 6 months. You make a calendar every day, ministerial meetings, informal meetings of ministers. We have planned 23 of them. We have about 45 ministerial meetings, always in Brussels, except in June and in April, where all the ministerial meetings takes place in Luxembourg. And the presidency calls the meeting, invites the participants, makes the agenda, writes the agenda, so it has some choice in the choice of items to be discussed. It brings the meeting to an end, to conclusions, because a meeting without conclusions is not very fruitful. So that which means that you sometimes have to work at compromises to come to these conclusions. And that is also an important part. We have to listen carefully to all sides, in the meeting room, but also outside the meeting room. We have to discuss all with the Commission, for instance, to see what is behind it, where are areas of compromise, what is technically possible, and so on. So important task to work at the compromises. We are also the negotiator for the Council with the European Parliament. That was an important task, as was said in the introductions. The presidency is mandated by the 26 other member states to defend a position. First, on the legislative proposal within the Council, a position is adopted, sometimes after very difficult negotiations. They can take sometimes years. We come to a position, and then we go to the Parliament. And the Parliament is doing just the same. They nominate a negotiator, which is called a rapporteur. Sometimes you have 2 of them. And they are the counterparts of the presidency in the negotiations, which are called trialogues. Trialogues, you hear 3. It's not just the Parliament and the Council, also the Commission is sitting there, but more as a kind of go-between matchmaker if needed, or technical support. So that is an important task of the presidency, of which we had very intense work. Maybe just two other numbers which give you an idea about the intensity of the work. So apart from these 23 informal ministerial meetings, 45 ministerial meetings, we have 100 high-level conferences, often of ministerial nature, not always, and about 1,500 working group meetings in 6 months. So it's and inside the permanent representation, we have two persons, the meeting managers. You can't believe it, but they work the whole day in matching the required meetings in the necessary rooms with the translation regimes, because sometimes you have English, which is, I think, even a minority. Usually you have at least French, German, and English languages which are translated and used. Sometimes you have a full regime of 24 languages also, when experts from the member states, from the capitals come to Brussels. So there is a complex task to find the right meeting room, which is large enough, with enough interpreters, exactly on the theme which the presidency thinks is important. So sometimes we have to come to our meeting coordinator and say, sorry, here you have to stop a little bit, because you use 24 interpreter teams and we need them for something else. Then we see, of course, a feeling of disillusionment and tristesse on the face, but that is one of the tasks of the presidency, to work according to the priorities and use our means well. The 3 words characterized our presidency program. To protect, we want to protect, to strengthen, and to prepare the European Union. It's very elementary, I know, but I think you find every dimension in the different aspects of the work which we have done. We want to protect our citizens, our borders, our rule of law, our economy, and even our bare security. So that is the protection demand. There is always a strengthening, because what we have is not bad, but it can be much better. So in many areas you see incremental changes, many debates are quite old. They date back even from the 70s, the 80s, but then a first timid attempt is done to introduce a regulation in a sector. It doesn't work very well, then it is upgraded, it is revised. So there is a permanent work of strengthening, and of course also the dimension of preparing also the Union for new challenges and for new tasks. In the first phase of our presidency, that was the law-making phase, we had about 150 files on the table, of which good half were eligible for an agreement with the Parliament. So about 70 we had already beforehand identified as being able to reach an agreement with the Parliament in the 3 months, January, February, March. We managed to do it in 67. In 67 files we got, and I will give you later some examples, just to give you an idea about the variety of themes on which we worked. The other themes, they have many reasons. Some are not ripe, so we have already, or we are working in the Council on a common position in the Council of the Member States, but we're not ripe yet to go to the Parliament. Sometimes they do not involve the Parliament, so also many subjects are not discussed with the European Parliament when it matters, for instance, when it relates to foreign policy, defense decisions, fiscal decisions, so taxation that is done merely at the level of the member states. So a good part of that is remain outside the remit of the Parliament. But in the 67 agreements, I think I give you a few examples just to show the variety. For instance, one of the first agreements which we reached was on the Ukraine facility, so which is a huge macro financial assistance program for Ukraine. We obtained that result early February. So it provides for 50 billion of grants and loans to Ukraine to support the government, to open the schools, the administrations, the public sector in this year and until 27. So that is quite a complex administration because you have all kinds of conditionalities, governance issues, who decides, the Ukrainians make a plan, then it is examined by the Commission, the member states wants to have a say, and so on. So that was an important, I think, an important political, also a very important decision. Think about all the efforts the Americans did to obtain an agreement for their $60 billion aid program. So we had a similar task to fulfill, but we were ready a little bit earlier. Then, so we did that adaptation of the multi-annual financial framework. So the overall value of the multi-annual financial framework, just to give you an idea, is 1,100 billion euros, so spread over 7 years. And so every year it's about a yearly budget of the European Union is 180 billion euros, but we make frameworks of 7 years, and it was topped up by 66 billion euros. Not very much, and the initial proposals of the Commission were quite higher. It was about 100 billion, but then the member states found it was too expensive for them, so it was reduced, and then the final cost price, the extra money that the member states have to bring on the table to make that possible, is 20 billion. And all the rest, the 40 others, are either loans or financed through redeployments and savings. So very difficult negotiation. I think for those who know a little bit European negotiations, MFF negotiations are not the best you can witness. It's not good for your mood. It's a bit depressing, like very often budgetary negotiations are, and that is also the same at European level. The EP was very disappointed with the result. They had hoped for much more. But the council position was reached unanimously with great efforts on the 1st of February, when finally also Hungary gave its green light, which was not very evident. Then another example, we had a package of anti-money laundering legislation adopted, also with a decision on a seat for the new anti-money laundering agency, which will be located in Frankfurt. We adopted a directive to combat violence against women and domestic violence. It was more in the justice area. I also took part in that negotiation. It was, I think, a very important piece of legislation which we adopted, setting standards all over the European Union. For member states like Belgium, the Netherlands and France, the parliamentarians of these member states were very disappointed. They found the ambition was too low. But for other member states, members of parliament came to me and they said, Ambassador, we're so happy we managed, because now our standard moves up it is undoable at national level, but thanks to that EU legislation, we are on a par with the other more advanced member states. It's nice to hear this kind of stories. We set a new set of rules on the economic governance, very important for Belgium and for other member states. I think it was maybe the most difficult negotiation of our presidency up till now, and with far-reaching consequences of how the national households are managed. So it was high time to come to an agreement, but we did it. We adapted also a set of rules, for instance, on the exchange of advanced passenger information. Looks very technical, but it's practical, very important. It is what can airline companies exchange with each other of data of the passengers which are on the plane for flights within the European Union. It's very well regulated. The transparency, the privacy has to be taken into account. So it's a very delicate balance to be found between security imperatives and interests of the police services and of those who work at security. It has to be balanced with also imperatives of democratic standards, security of the privacy, and so on. So there was a difficult negotiation, but quite useful. We reformed the Schengen Border Code, which is also quite relevant for most citizens. Under which condition can you do border checks within the Schengen zone? So we had rules, but they were, since the COVID period, a little bit abandoned. You had remarked yourself that member states invoked all kinds of security situations and force majeure, and it became very disorganized. So a new set of rules was adopted. We had a growth facility for the Western Balkans, so a little bit similar to the Ukraine facility, but we also adopted a growth facility for the Balkans, 6 billion grants, loans. It was the last agreement which we concluded early April. Quite a difficult one. I must admit, at some point I thought that this will not work. The mandate I received from the member states, I cannot bridge the gap with the position of the parliament. At some point I was really reflecting on the eve of the last trialogue with my collaborators. Shall I just go back to the Coreper and say, look, we tried, but with this mandate I couldn't do it. But we did it, so we went over our mandate. And we had to explain to colleagues why we thought it was important enough to take the responsibility and the liberty to go a little bit beyond what the member states wanted to give to the presidency. They found it indeed, okay, they pardoned me, and we could go on. But it's important. I mean, it's part of the enlargement process, which is a very difficult process. It takes years, and it's an extremely, also a little bit a demotivating process for the inhabitants, the citizens of these countries. But with this program, we can inject money for convergence projects much quicker. So, because we arrived at that decision back early April, and the Parliament did an extreme effort to speed up the normal procedures. The first funds can already go to small projects in Montenegro, in Albania, in North Macedonia, and so on from the summer onwards. And that is really also what is Europe. It's bringing us together to lifting the convergence, to converge the standards of how our societies are organized. And then very quickly, so maybe in the environment area, we adopted new CO2 emission standards for heavy-duty vehicles, for trucks and tractors. We adopted a directive on the urban wastewater treatment. We worked at new rules and standards to promote the right to repair goods, to avoid that goods are thrown away when they don't work. So we have to be more careful with these things. This is also now caught in the new legislation. Important for our strategic autonomy, we adopted, we reached an agreement with the Parliament on the Critical Raw Materials Act. It's also quite an interesting piece of legislation that is really what the Americans do, what the Chinese do. We make a framework in which we try to organize we set objectives for providing raw materials in different types and categories for the European Union. We give some indications on where rules can be relaxed to delve these minerals. The permitting system is simplified. So it's quite an interesting legislation. But that is a direct answer to challenges of insufficient supply or presence of raw materials in the European Union. So we have to create a framework which helps to do that more, because the rare earths, for instance, they are not so rare. They are massively, delved in China. They are processed. It's a very dirty business, but we have them too. But we prefer to leave them in the ground because it's bad for the environment. So we need to find the right conditions where you can produce them, you can treat them, proceed them, but all the way also by respecting a minimum of environmental norms. And then very quickly, a few examples which maybe speak to your imagination. So we adopted or found an agreement with the Parliament on the establishment of a European disability card, which can be used in cars, parking lots in cities. We had an agreement on a regulation on the packaging and the packaging waste. There again, it's the idea of recycling of waste, with imposing rules on European producers, but also on products imported from third countries. So also what they produce, the carton and the piepschuim and whatever, which is used in the plastics to protect goods, have to be also organized in such a way that they can be recycled and can be collected. I think it was a quite interesting and a difficult negotiation. With the Cybersecurity Act, a European health data space regulation was adopted. And then maybe just a last word on the Migration and Asylum Pact. It's quite, it's quite well known everywhere. This was an agreement negotiated by the Spanish presidency just in December, just before we took over. But we had a task to bring it through the council. So because our team, we had to defend in Coreper the result which the Spanish had negotiated. It's not so easy, that kind of tasks, of course, because you don't know all the backroom deals and the tricks and all the elements which were used to come to an agreement. But so after a negotiation, you go back to the council and you ask to the 26 member states, do you agree with the result? And so that is, this was done. It took some efforts, I must say, to interpret, to calm down fears of other member states. Then we had to do the same work with the European parliamentarians, because then they had to do also to approve what the rapporteurs brought back from the negotiation. There we had also to work. Our State Secretary Nicole de Moor was also asked to do some outreach. I had to do some outreach to parliamentarians. So it was work done by the Spanish, but you see how we work integrated as a team. We had to carry it through the council. And if all goes well, not normally, tomorrow Coreper will give the final vote. So the parliament voted already, and now procedurally, that's an A point as it is called, so there's no debate on it, but it will be adopted formally, and then the signature and the publication will follow very quickly in the next weeks, in 10 days even. So that is some of the examples. Most of these files are adopted with a qualified majority. I don't know to what extent you are familiar with that. So, which is, as the word says, it's more than just a majority of half plus one. It is a qualified majority. So it's a bit more to be sure that you have substantial support for the acts which you adopt. That is the general rule. It is 55% of the number of member states and 65% of the population which has to be behind a decision. We have a calculator in our mobile phones to check in negotiations, are we reaching that threshold or not? A minority, but important rules are still decided by unanimity. And then, of course, then it becomes very difficult. So a budget negotiation is with unanimity. Topping up the multi-annual financial framework is done with unanimity. And then begins, of course, the bargaining. You get this if you give me that, and so on. Endless negotiations, very difficult. For fiscal matters, we do that, budgetary affairs, fiscal matters. And also mostly in foreign affairs and security-related decisions. We had, for instance, sanctions packages, so we are now discussing the 14th sanctions package that will be done on the basis of unanimity. We have now discussions ongoing on immobilized assets. What do we do with that? We can speak about that later if you want, and that is also done on the basis of unanimity. So this is, as you see, it is a harvest season. But so every, I think, presidency in this time of the year, I think, would normally have quite a lot of results. But I must admit, it's not always, it doesn't fall in your lap. So it is sometimes a heavy delivery. But happy what we did. But it's not finished yet. And I'm coming to the last part. This, now we are in the second phase of our presidency. And in the remaining weeks, I see three important clusters of work to be done. So first, we continue doing legislative work, but within the council. So we have actually 30 projects on the table where we still have to find agreement among 27. for instance, legislation on insolvency, modernization. There is on tax law, we have a couple of examples. There's the Child Sexual Abuse Directive. It was in the Flemish media, a couple of articles a couple of days ago. Maybe you read that. So that is also on the table, quite a delicate thing. Where is the balance between control for security reasons and privacy, again? So that's the legislative work. Second, we continue to focus quite a lot of our work on the support and the defense of Ukraine. That remains, I mean, a clear priority. So as I said, we work at a new sanctions package. We will update the rules on the temporary protection of Ukrainian refugees in the European Union. There is the financing of the military assistance. We have several projects ongoing. We work towards the justice for war crimes in Ukraine, but there's more international legal projects, but which takes up quite a lot of energy. We will assist the Swiss in organizing a peace conference in June on the basis of the Zelensky plan. And we prepare also the start of enlargement negotiations with Ukraine. So and there is some ambition vested in the Belgian presidency before another presidency takes over. And then the third leg, then we really look to the future. You alluded already to it. And so we have actually two tasks to work out. First, we have to work at a strategic agenda. So which is a small policy document which every 5 years the heads of state and government make, and in which they give the main orientations for the Commission for the next 5 years. Many of these issues are rather well known. It will be about the green transition and the digital revolution and to increase the competitivity of the European companies. But I think there will be some new accents with the lessons learned of what we have experienced in the past years. So other than 2019, I'm sure, we're not there yet, we haven't seen really texts, but there will be a chapter on defense industry. I think health will become more prominent. It is a member state competence in essence, but we have seen that you can do some very useful things at EU level. I think the defense of the rule of law is also an experience which we had inside the European Union and outside with candidates is a very important point. We can go in much more detail if you want later. So that is, then also we will give special attention to the Capital Markets Union, which is now also a point of focus in these weeks. We were helped very well by a report which the Belgian government ordered to Mr. Enrico Letta, who was a former Italian prime minister, and who just wrote and published a report on the future of the single market. I think very interesting reading for many of you here. And soon we will receive another report, but then more on competitivity by another former Italian Prime Minister, Mario Draghi. That is expected end of June, early July. But the main elements of these reports, they will be normally injected in that strategic agenda for the coming years as a guidance for the Commission. And then, even a level more difficult, that's the roadmap for reforms. That was also asked by the European Council of December last year. The roadmap of reforms is a kind, what it says, a roadmap. It's a small paper, we don't know yet how it will look like, but before the end of June, the President of the European Council, assisted by Coreper, working groups, some ministerial debates, will try to find out in which areas the future European Union will have to adapt in order to perform better. As I said in the beginning, we can always improve our working. So it is a continuous process. It's a little bit like the state reform in Belgium. It's never stable. It happens exactly the same at European level. Competences move a little bit, they change, power relations move, and so now and then treaties have to be adapted, or at least the rules of how you come to decisions and the working of the institutions has to be adapted. In itself, there's already a good reason to reform now and then. But what is now triggering more urge is, of course, a prospect of enlargement. A long time, a couple of years ago, this was a very far away prospect. We had negotiations ongoing with Western Balkans countries since many years already, but at a very slow pace. But now with the war in Ukraine, all this is looked at in a different perspective. And we also gave the status of candidate to Ukraine, for instance. We decided that negotiations could start, and now we are working towards the real start, the real kickoff of the negotiations. But that brings, of course, a lot of interrogations and questions. Because this is not just a small state that will join the European Union. It is an agricultural superpower. It is the size of a bit bigger than France, very well populated. It's also an industrial powerhouse also. I don't speak then even of the geopolitical complications and its position, and we shall see where it will be in a couple of years. But that prospect is real, and it brings us back, us Europeans, also to the drawing table. How can we organize European Union? The policies, is it normal, or do we go on giving 2/3 of our budget to agricultural support and cohesion funds, which bring together the economies of the member states? 2/3 is injected in that. Can we accept that kind of level of financing? What will be the consequences for us? Unless you expand the European budget massively, it will reduce what the existing member states become. The poor member states will become rich member states by the way of statistics, because the candidates now, we have 10 candidates, they're all poorer than the poorest, in terms of GDP per capita, poorer than the poorest of the European Union now. So, I mean, that changes a little bit the perspective. So we shall see where it brings. We don't have to solve that, of course, as a presidency, but we have to help to contribute to making a roadmap for the new leadership of the European Union that will be designated at the end of June, new president of the Commission, of the Parliament, of the European Council, the foreign affairs responsible, the high representative. So we will try to deposit a small paper, a roadmap, with some of the themes which have to be detailed, some of the issues discussed, maybe kind of a methodology, maybe a timing, we shall see. Delicate operation, but some of the questions are really existential for the European Union. So we shall see where we get after the elections also, now the new leadership that will bring about. Now I will conclude with a few very short concluding remarks. So first, the situation in the world is quite serious and quite menacing, and I will not repeat, you have understood that. But we as Europeans, we are not powerless. I really want to stress that. We are not powerless. With unity and determination, we can really take to some point our fate in our hands. And the more unity we show, the more results it produces. So, and as a Belgian presidency, we are proud to have played a modest but a real role in it. And that is part of the answer on the question. Can we make the difference? Well, it's maybe not to me to say it, but I mean, we had a chance to, in that special juncture of periods, to help steer the agenda and carry it out. And that's important. So we could make a little bit, I think, a difference. But due to the recent events, and often of a transformative nature, I think we had the chance to work at a change of ages, of periods in the history of the European Union. We had turbulent years behind us, and new perspectives are opening up. We are taking on a geopolitical role which maybe we didn't really want, but which was given to us, and which we have to take up if we want also to respond to the citizens who trust the leadership of the European Union, that they can receive in return protection and but also prosperity, and to develop their own plans. So this is a special period, a moment of transition, and I think it will inevitably also in the coming months and years lead to a reflection on how far can this European construction go. Is it, you know, we're not a state, but we're not an institution either. It's something in between. It is a kind of confederal construct with some federal characteristics, open for debate, but it's not so easy to describe it. Member states will always play an important role in it. That is inevitable given our history and the way we are. But some changes are still possible. Not spectacularly, that is also open for debate maybe, but the small changes which we can bring to the functioning of the European Union, that is, I think, one of the tasks of the next years. So, and to conclude, I hope you will think a little bit about all that when you will prepare in the next weeks to cast your vote in the European elections on the 9th of June, because I think it is more important than what people sometimes think. So, thank you for your attention.
Does this work? Yeah, perfect. So I'd like to invite you to join me here if you would like to take a seat. If you prefer standing, that's fine as well. Great. Thank you very much for taking us through the complexity of a presidency and the European Union. I know we have some study abroad students here. I hope you didn't get lost in the complexity of the European Union. Feel free to ask any question that you have. We have one of the best experts to answer any of those questions. I would like to open the floor and give everyone the chance to ask a question. I also have some of my own if you need some time. When you take the floor, I would like to ask you to just tell us briefly what your name is, what your affiliation is, and then please don't give it a second lecture. Ask a question that has a question mark at the end, so that we can really give everyone the chance to ask his or her question. If there's no, there's the arm. So you don't give me the chance to ask my question. I might get to this later, but perfect. So then I would like to give you the floor first here in the middle, and then there will be another one in the back. And the third one there.
Hello, my name is Manon Colombo. I am an intern at the Coimbra group, so my question is going to be related to universities. So you mentioned the principles of protect, prepare and strengthen the European Union, and I just wanted to know, what do you think of the role of universities in these objectives, and what are your perspectives for the future of universities? Thank you.
Great. I would suggest that we start collecting 3 questions. There will be many rounds, but I know that in the end we will otherwise run out of time. So I would like to give the floor to the lady in the back, and then we have Indiana in the front.
Thank you, Karin Sipido. I am from the Faculty of Medicine, and I have a particular interest in the policies for health. You mentioned that the health could be an important point for change in the coming years for the European Union. The initiative for European Health Union so far has remained within the confines of the current treaty. And the question is that we ask ourselves, is it possible to go farther under the current treaty? Or do you see the need and the potential for changes to the treaty that would give more competence to the European Union regarding health?
And I think having a lawyer, that's a good question. And then maybe one of my students, Indiana, there. And then we'll give you the chance to answer the first 3.
So thank you very much for this presentation. It was really interesting. And as an international politics student and pursuing my master, I'm writing about energy transition. And I would like to ask you, I'm as well a fervent believer that the EU should adapt and in order to perform better. And I would like to ask you, beyond diversification, what are the lessons learned from the EU from this energy crisis? Thank you.
Great, that's already quite a range. Universities, health and energy crisis. I give you the floor.
Well, the first question was on the role of universities in, how would I say, the European construction. I think that universities always played an important role because they are centers of learning, of exchange. The word Erasmus comes to mind. So I think that is maybe one of the most tangible and successful programs ever developed at European Union level, and really instilling a concrete dimension in what can be the life of a human being, of a citizen, in a unified space where you can move, where you can work, where you can earn money and make the project of your life. So I think only for that alone, I think universities are, I think, a key breeding ground for future Europeans. Literally and sometimes. Good. So that's important. And then, of course, you have the centers of learning, of research. I think there is a vast range of university courses on European integration. I think they are key, but I would maybe even enlarge a little bit. I wish that the level of teaching and learning about how the EU works would go a little bit deeper. I mean, going in age. Actually, in secondary schools, I think it would be a basic a basic requirement to have or give a small course to pupils of 12, 13, 14 years of how the EU works, because they all get courses on how Belgium works, I guess the history of Belgium, but I think it would be of a tremendous benefit if it was a part of school programs of when the basic functioning of how that structure Europe works. It is a layer like other layers. It's not, well, it's complicated, but it's not so complicated. It depends on how you explain it. So that is, I think, a big role, maybe for the future commission or for future work programs. Then on health, well, so actually, I don't have now the details of the articles and so before my eyes, but the COVID crisis showed that with some determination and legal creativity, you can go quite far in coordinating the activities of the member states. And so there are some articles in the treaty so which allow which go beyond the very specific policies or destinations, and which can be used in cases of emergency. And they were used sometimes also on the basis of internal market legal bases to take the necessary measures, but also in the health field. And I think the vaccine procurement program was, I think, maybe the most spectacular example of what at EU level was possible to do in times of crisis by a voluntary decision of member states to give that competence to the Commission, because it is really that. It was done without a treaty change. It was done by the mere will of the 27 member states, and they understood that in the given circumstances that was the best way to do forward. In normal times, I think that would have been impossible. But just in that crisis period, we could go far beyond what was possible by the treaties. It doesn't mean it's illegal, because it was based also on a voluntary act by the member states, and there were some flexible interpretations of other legal bases. Will that legal base be expanded in the future? Maybe. I trust it will be done. I trust it will be done if a new round of treaty amendments and treaty change comes up. But I'm not sure it will happen quickly, because, I mean, past treaty changes have generated sometimes almost traumatic experiences in some member states, really traumatic experiences with lost referenda and governments that fell and so on. So the appetite is very low, I would say, to amend treaties. But you never know. One day it will happen. I think it's a rule of law, almost natural law rule in the European Union, that the structure will adapt it, that the legal text will follow the reality on the ground, and then maybe your ID will have a chance, I hope. And then on the energy transition, yeah, the lessons of the crisis, well, it was also, I mean, we developed policies which were probably impossible to do without a crisis. For energy crises, there is a specific general article, I think it's 122 in the treaty, which gives the power in situations of emergency and crisis, also related to energy, to take exceptional measures. And that was used, so in the autumn of 22, to, for instance, to create that program of the obligation to store gas reserves. The common procurement of gas contracts was decided in that period. There was also, now I remember, a measure was decreed which gave the possibility to member states to take off the over-profits of energy companies at a time. That was also based on a European decision. So there we really moved the goalposts. Also because in times of crisis, it was accepted that this was the best way forward to protect ourselves.
Yeah, never waste a good crisis, right? And also on the universities, I think our vicerector Lievens is the driving force of UNO Europa, one of the university alliances that we have. So another good example of European cooperation. Do you have a question on that? Then let's give him the floor and prepare your questions.
Yeah, well, I was hesitating to ask the question, but since the question on competences came up concerning health, we are now, as you know, and many in the room know as well, with UNO Europa and other European universities alliances, struggling to get a couple of files really off the ground, like making the awarding of joint degrees, in a European degree framework, for instance, or a European degree label framework, more easy to realize. And there are other aspects as well related to the competences of Europe, or the absence of competences of Europe, for instance in higher education, like when it concerns academic freedom, institutional independence and so on. So a lot of European values that of course we want to adhere within European universities and also in the collaborations. So the same question actually holds also there. What do you think of any room in the future, maybe not near future, of some shared competence for higher education, and then in particular when it concerns European values and collaboration between higher education institutions?
Thank you. I had a hand raised there, and then let's go. Oh, let's take these two, and then we'll get to you later, and then we'll move there.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction in the complexity of European politics. I'm Anne Hermans, and recently I was president of an umbrella association in civil society, Seniors Association linked to the European People's Party. And I would like to highlight 2 points. The first point, can you comment on the pillar of social rights? I think for several reasons this is a very important domain. And you can look at it also as a sign of working together, of cooperation, and it's not because Marianne Thijssen is here in the room, but it is because it was and it is a very important sign for the working together of the member states. And the second point, my question is, can you comment on it? And what can we expect from it in the near future? And I was very glad that the Belgian presidency didn't forget this social pillar. Thank you. And a second point that I would like to highlight is you deserve more visibility.
Thank you. It was not a question, but well appreciated. And the gentleman in the row before, and then we get to you later.
Thank you very much. Thomas Nagy, MBA, European Public Policy and Management. I would like to know, why did it take 2 years for the European Union to seriously step up its help for Ukraine about armament? And what do you know about the evolution of it? Because right now we're supposed to provide 1.5 million shells for this year alone, and we're only at 400,000. So what is the evolution? I know there was a major package that passed, but what can you tell us about it?
Again, quite a range of topics.
Well, on the first question by Professor Lievens, yes, it's interesting what you say, because it shows very concretely what the challenges are for you here in the education field. I hear you saying that you're trying to come to common standards as regards areas which touch on fundamental rights applied to education. And that is maybe interesting, because there is one important actor in the European Union, it is the Court of Justice, which supervises. I don't say you have to go to court, but I say in general, I mean, it plays an important role sometimes when citizens, because they go to courts, not the court goes to the citizens. Citizens, companies, governments, they go to court because they think they can oblige an interpretation of European law, for instance, in the area of fundamental laws, which is applied to their situation, and where they think they are badly treated, or where a more uniform treatment is possible. So that is maybe, if you don't want to wait until a treaty change, which I said is not really coming up very soon, that is sometimes, in general, a way which has brought a tremendous progress in the development of European competences and European law. Then on the pillar of social rights, Madam Hermans, I'm really very happy that you asked that question and raised it, because actually of the Belgian government, this was an important aspect of our program. It was more, I would say, organized through conferences. We actually collaborated to two important conferences. One was in Val d'Uchaise, which is the end of January, in which 40 years of the social dialogue in Europe was commemorated. It was an heritage of Jacques Delors, and also President von der Leyen was very keen on doing a special activity in Val d'Uchaise, where it all started. And then in April, so two of our government ministers, the Minister of Social Affairs and of Work, organized a conference in La Hulpe exactly to examine how so the European pillar of social rights could be further developed. It is traditionally an important dimension in our work, and I think the Belgian government was in a perfect position to bring there together hundreds of experts and of all kinds of walks of life, but also particularly of a very high level, to reflect on it and to promote it. The concept is, I would say, as an observer, seeping in slowly in European law. Yeah. I think an important milestone was set in Porto. That was in 2021. That was a European Council, an informal European Council in Porto. It was the first one after COVID, actually. And there a declaration was adopted in which, a promotion was made for the further elaboration of that catalogue of social rights, which we consider as a common heritage in the European Union. So, and the conference in La Hulpe now, which took place last month so near Brussels, that built further on that. So thanks for that question. It's important and it deserves attention. But I must say, strange enough, in some member states, it's not well known and not always so much appreciated. So that is also, a part of the story, and maybe one of the explanations why sometimes the pace of the promotion of this concept is slower than what we in Belgium would wish. Then, yeah, on your question on the munition production, why does it take so much time? Actually, we are, of course, you should never forget that context. We lived in the European Union since 1945 in a haven of peace. It doesn't mean it was always a paradise. We also had revolutions, we had civil war in the Balkans, but all in all, it was a very privileged space where borders were respected, which gave, security and certainty to the citizens, inhabitants. These borders were historically determined, not always corresponding exactly to the populations and the language groups and the cultures which lived there. And that has now been breached for the first time. And that makes, the historic nature of what happened. And but it also explains why we Europeans have really difficulties in adapting to that, accepting that we are now in such a world. It is like a broken dream sometimes for many people. And so I'm not looking for excuses, because I share your interrogations personally, and also even your frustration, which I hear a little bit. It's normal. It's terrible to listen to the difficulties which are still present, to coagulate contracts, to make not small orders of nations, member states, but to bring it together, to have common procurement, to give an industrial perspective to the producers, because we have the capacity to produce 1.5 million shells. That is, each time we go into the details, and the Commission and also the External Action Service, we have done quite a lot of examinations of the market in the European Union. But the companies there, they lack orders. You need a nice order. That is what happens, what we hear in the United States. There are sometimes when the federal government in Washington decides $2 billion. That gives a perspective also to a small company of 200 people. They know we can now produce for 5 years, we have a future. And in the European Union, these orders are usually, they are processed at a national scale, so, and these are small orders. And most member states have their own munitions factories, and so you order in your own country. I know it's not good, and we are now feeling the limits of these practices, and that is one of the projects which we are now discussing also at the negotiating table. There is a project which we still have to discuss and to advance, which is called the European Defence Investment Programme, EDIP. So you can find the text if you want on the internet, I'm sure. And that exactly tries to organize at industrial level the defense production. So the European Union is not a NATO. We are not a defense pact. We are not a military organization. But through the means of the internal market, through the means of industrial policy, where the EU has competences, through the means of research policy, where the EU has competences and budgets, you can come to a more efficient production, for instance, also in armaments and munition. It was not nice. It was sometimes a little bit like the tobacco industry a couple of years ago, which I sometimes tell. There was always a tinge of, its weapons is to kill people, but I think we now experience that this is a matter of life and death, and not just for the Ukrainians, but probably also for us. So it becomes an important matter, and it is now having a lot of attention, but thanks God, we don't have that tradition of, military provisioning and planning. It is something we didn't know and which we are now learning by doing. And we work hard at it. And I can say in my committee, it's almost 1/3 of the time on different kinds of projects. Financing, optimizing production, it's a very important part of the work.
Thank you. So I already promised the floor to the gentleman here, and I'm looking, that we have many arms on that side. So, yeah.
Good afternoon. Also, thank you very much for the very clear presentation. I'm Davy Messotten. I'm working for the European Parliament, for the administration. Just, is it possible to elaborate a little bit on the Green Deal actions that Belgium did? For example, also the Energy Efficiency Directive for buildings that was voted, I think 2 months ago in Parliament after the first reading. Is it part of the 27 files that is still on the agenda, for example? Just to give a global picture, please.
Thank you. I think there was a hand here in the middle. You see the gentleman there?
Walter Luijten, KU Leuven. You mentioned the challenge of decision by unanimity, but we recently saw an interesting innovation. Apparently, unanimity can be reached if you vote when the sole dissenting person has left for the restroom. I think it's a very innovative idea. And I was just wondering, has this set a precedent? And can you go further? So if 2 dissenting people leave, can you still reach unanimity? So how far can you stretch this concept?
Okay, inducing diarrhea might not be a strategy to get consensus. Maybe let's move to in the back. I saw a hand. Is there one? No? Well, there's a lady in the middle with the blonde hair there. Behind you, yeah.
Thank you. I am a law student at the University of Copenhagen, and here I'm Erasmus. I just would like to talk or ask a bit about the relationship between deepening the cooperation and enlarging the union at the same time. You touched about it briefly, but I just wanted to hear your thoughts on sort of how to do both at once. Is that even possible, and what are the potential for this sort of cooperation?
Great. We have Green Deal voting in absence of some people and deepening and enlarging.
Yeah, very good. So on Green Deal, we could have, of course, a conference on its own right, but it remains, I think, one of the major themes of action, challenges for the European Union, for member states, for companies, I think for the management of university, for the households. So it is really, it is one of these historic transformations which we are now experiencing. It is actually, it's the decarbonization, and I think it is as important as the electrical revolution or the steam revolution in the 17th or the 18th or the 19th century. So so to say, so it is an essential part of the legislative programming. We also experienced that. So indeed the energy efficiency directive was adopted. But I gave other examples, for instance, about the CO2 emissions for heavy duty vehicles was heavily fought in the council, and it is also about how to reduce CO2 emissions of the tractors and the trucks, and so. We were confronted, if I may say, during our presidency, and it is happening already since, not just since the beginning of this year, but since last year. There is a kind of cold water fear in applying, of course, the recipes of a true radical Green Deal. We committed in the European Union, also as signatories of the Treaty of Paris, to strive for a carbon-free society in 2050. That actually is a revolutionary concept, but it's now international law. It is adopted, and so we are bound by that perspective. And if you want to reach that, you have to every year to increase the level of ambition to come to that objective. And as very often, the incremental steps at the end are always the most difficult to do because the low-hanging fruit is already done. So, I mean, we are before some difficult years in which we have really to go for these last miles. And there was a kind of, and it still is, a kind of reverse movement in society living, and it's understandable, I think, also. And not just in industry, confronted with very demanding regulatory framework, comparing with what other competitors do outside the European Union, where I think they are better off, so to say. I mean, households are sometimes hesitating. In the agricultural sector, and there are hesitations whether these objectives are doable, given, I mean, in a competitive environment, also in which you have to be able to survive as a human being and earn a decent life. So there are hesitations. So we have to deal with that. I think that the consensus is that the course is good, has to be followed. We earn a lot, we win a lot. So we also, for geopolitical reasons, it's good for the climate, or to mitigate the warming of the climate. You're never sure exactly, but it will at least mitigate the effects of climate. You are less dependent on fossil energy, which we don't have in the European Union. And that is, it's like in a monopoly game. You have cards, players with good cards, others with less good cards, but we don't have the energy cards that are the Americans, for instance. Okay, it's good starting position for them. Doesn't mean you cannot win, but you have to play it otherwise. So it is also for that a good choice to go in that direction and not change too much of the course because you encounter difficulties. So for geopolitical reasons, you get more independent because you use the sources which you have as much as possible. And then third, it is a new technology which is promising and which is followed by others. So there is a market for it. So you can exploit it, you can develop technologies, you can sell it, you can set the standards in other parts of the world. And the best proof was that the IRA in the United States showed that finally, maybe through other means, the United States also wants to become greener and created a huge investment program based on subsidies. And also in the Far East, you see that very well. I lived 4 years in Tokyo, for instance, which is now it's a huge town, but it's quite a nice town. It was extremely polluted in the 60s. There was heavy industry very close to town. It was like London, also in the 50s, in the 60s. But the Japanese, without the Treaty of Paris, but they felt we have to take care of the population, of health, and we have to evacuate these dirty, polluting industries. We have to transform it, make it cleaner, and get it out of town. The same is happening in China at an extremely high speed, because I mean it's unlivable in the big Chinese towns. Everybody has stories about the mist layers and so on. So they do it. So there is a market for it, and if we are not rapid, they will develop their own technologies, which is of course a nightmare. So there are many good reasons to go in the direction, but we have to take care of some correctors, some conditions which merit also consideration. It must be doable for our industry, for our competitors. They must be able to work, to produce also here, to avoid imports from everywhere. And that is what here and there we try to do with the Critical Raw Materials Act. That was a little bit a side act, but we also have the Net Zero Industry Act, which was an act which was adopted under the presidency to give a little bit of space to industry, but in a net zero environment. So it will be a difficult debate for the remaining, the coming years, I guess, but it is extremely, extremely relevant. Then on unanimity in the coffee or the restroom, yes, it's nice that you asked the question, because it's something bizarre. It's not normal, and it cannot be repeated at a large scale, because it will undermine the system in which we work. But it happened. It's ambiguous. It happened once. And to be very correct, it happened something similar 2 months later. It's a public information. You can read it in the media, or you can find it in the conclusions of the European Council. In March, the European Council adopted an ambitious set of conclusions on Ukraine. And it's quite interesting to read, 3 pages, and all kinds of the support, the munition, microfinancial assistance, the efforts we do for justice, and so on. There's a very broad range of issues on the policy of the European Union towards Ukraine. And then the Hungarian Prime Minister asked a footnote to be added to the conclusions, saying that Hungary fundamentally opposes the course of action of the European Union towards Ukraine. And that was added to the minutes of the meeting. So it's also a bizarre situation. I mean, so the conclusions were adopted unanimously,